Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Before going on to the presentation about DevOps patterns, I'd like to start that I'm Paulo Marques. I just recently finished my master's in informatics and computing back in July. And if you want to reach out to me, there's my contact, my email, and my LinkedIn if you want to message me about. So, a little bit of context behind this. DevOps, as we all know, it's pretty much growing as a topic of research, as a topic of enterprises adopting it. And as a consequence, if you go online and search for DevOps practices, there are a ton of resources out there that you can use to try to see what are the best practices or not. So, but we noticed there were a bit of problems with those resources. The first one was most of those resources were not detailed enough. So if you come to DevOps as a bit of a beginner, you might read them all and be like, okay, so what really is continuous integration? What is automate your deployment? So we sensed that was the lack of detail there. On the other hand, we saw some more detailed resources, but we saw a bit of bias in them. So some companies that are related to tooling in CI/CD tools have posted their guides on what they think are the best practices and whatnot. However, we felt that was more like a bias towards their tools, so the best practices would be using their tools with those practices, and not more independent approach and saying, okay, if you adopt these practices, you have all these benefits, but you lose on some of these, which if you have monetary interest in that, you will not say it. So that was a bit of our context behind, and to tackle this, we first decided to study existing DevOps practices, and then we decided to document them as patterns. So patterns basically are good solutions to recurring problems. And for those patterns, we decided to evaluate the consequence of them in a case study within our organization. I'll go a bit further into detail what patterns look like later, but this is pretty much what we gathered. So we call them foundational patterns because we decided to focus mostly on the patterns that most of the literature, both scientific literature and gray literature like blog posts and websites, agree that were part of DevOps. So starting from the top left, we have version control everything, which in a nutshell is everything you need to run and operate your software must be in version control. This includes the application code, dependencies, infrastructure code, infrastructure configurations, application configurations, and so on. Then we have continuous integration. So continuous integration, you should get a large feature and split it into incremental changes. And those changes should run them against some suite of tests to get faster feedback on those changes. Then moving on, we have the deployment automation. So that's pretty self-explanatory. So deployment automation should automate your deployment process as much as possible. Then moving on to the left a bit, after you deploy your software, you have the need to know how it is doing in the production environment. If there are some outages, if there are some downtime, some degraded performance. And that's where monitoring and observability come in. So you should have the tools to go to check on the health status of your software. Finally, we have cloud infrastructures, which pretty much brings on all the benefits of using cloud like availability and so on. So I don't expect you to read this, it's a lot of text, but a pattern structure pretty much looks like this. So we first have a context. If this pattern, that helps us to see if this pattern is adequate for us to compare it against our context as well. Then we have the problem. The problem is just what the pattern tries to solve. Then we have the forces. The forces, the best example of forces I can think of is the trade-off between costs and performance, for example, in some solutions. We have to balance both. There's more forces usually in patterns, but that's pretty much how they work. You have to balance and find a sweet spot on them. Then we have the solution. So our solutions usually are a bit abstract, so you can use in more different contexts, not just a specific context. But we try to provide enough detail so if you read it, okay, you can deduce immediately how you would use this solution in your context. Then we have the consequences of solution. Usually, we try to keep both positive and negative consequences for the most information possible. And then we have the weighted patterns. So this explains the relations between the pattern in question and others that were present that the figure I previously showed. Finally, we have the matrix that's a bit different than most patterns out there. It's not in the DevOps context, but they make sense in the DevOps context, since you have to keep in mind that you need to continuously improve your solutions. So how do you improve without knowing how good they are performing? So that's why we suggest some metrics for patterns. Okay, moving on to the case study. So we conducted a case study in an organization where we implemented some of the patterns, and in the end we conducted a survey on the professionals from that organization and asked them if they agreed or not with the consequences. So in version control everything, I'll not explain for you to read all the consequences, I'm just trying to point out maybe one or two. The last one, that's a bit more debatable, it was when changing teams, it takes time to get used to the new version control strategies. So they felt that it was a bit debatable, a bit towards they felt it would take a bit of time to adapt, but some debating there. As for continuous integration, the ones that stand out the most are the negative ones that they discuss. It is more complexity when you have to break down a larger feature into smaller increments, and they felt also that there was more complexity by having to maintain and create and maintain a test suite. Finally, for deployment automation, all the consequences that we suggested, the professionals agree with all of them, so there was not much discussion on that. And okay, so to sum up a bit and put this into like, what's a good use for this outside academia? So patterns are a good way to get familiarized with a new topic. So if you are a beginner to the DevOps field, or maybe you're just not a tech guy, maybe you are from management and you have to know how your team or your company is doing in terms of those practices, patterns are maybe a good starting point for that. Then it was mathematics that lacked on the formal scientific literature, so he tried to address that. And finally, we try to be impartial in terms of our patterns and try to provide both the good and the bad consequences.